quick kind of introduction to Professor Sharan. Professor Sharan is a professor at the Center for Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, Delhi. He's trained as a historian. His research interests are in the field of urban infrastructure and environmental issues. He's the author of In the City Out of Place, Nuisance, Pollution and Dwelling in Modern Delhi, 1860 to 2000, OUP, 2014 publication, I think for all of us. This is a classic which will stay for the next 100 years at least. So I think that says it all. More recently, he's completed a study of smoke nuisance in Bombay and Calcutta titled Waste as Pollution, A History of Smoke in Colonial India, 1860 to 1940, Orient Black Swan, forthcoming. Before joining the Center CSDS's faculty, Professor Sharan worked with the Sarai program. He's also been working intermittently on the history of rivers in North India, examining the interface between urban infrastructure and environment. He's delivered guest lectures at SPA Delhi and at Delhi universities. His works have been published in various research journals and the Sarai Reader series. Today he's going to speak on waste as pollution, historical reflections on urban air. For people, as an aside to the official kind of intro, for people like us who are interested in urban issues, who come from kind of various disciplines, what is particularly interesting about Dipu Sharan's work is the intersections of an imagination of technocratic modernity, modernism, which kind of finds reflection in various instruments over the years, particularly from colonial times to now. The intersections with kind of an older historical imagination and the current kind of technocratic play which we are kind of constantly confronted with in newspapers and the like. The other part which I find very interesting about his work is a locational emphasis, a rigorous locational emphasis of the city, and in particular in this book, Delhi. Very, very detailed archival work coming out, which also buttresses the case for cities of the global south as specific centers, specific locations in themselves, and not kind of this thesis of modernity which has to come to Indian cities later. Nirmal Bosu's work of deferred modernity, etc. So, but in what ways does this play out in the actual kind of spatial locations, one after the other, is something that I find very interesting. The second, of course, is a thesis which came out a few years ago, which is now much kind of in vogue, which is this whole question of what is nuisance, and how do municipal authorities over history, how have they perceived nuisance, how is it defined, who gets knocked out in that, who gets shifted, whose perception nuisance, all of that. And along with it, questions of what is hazardous, what is not, and how does that actually affect planning decisions, policy decisions, and so on. And so a lot of what we see in over the last 10-15 years in Delhi itself is something that has been playing out in various ways over the last 150 years at least. So I won't come in any more between you and Professor Sharan. All yours.
Thank you, Amlan. The book may or may not last for even 10 years, but we'll see about that. When I did this book, where it ended was on a question mark, which is there was a lot happening in Delhi around relocation of industries. And I happened to go across to Ghaziabad to see some of the industries that had been relocated. And one asked the question, so what happens? So we have thrown them out of Delhi, they've gone to Rajasthan or UP or wherever they've gone, and has pollution ended? And so what then is the limit of the planning exercise in trying to understand how do you manage the environment, whether it's air or water? And while most people would then go and do more research about the contemporary city, I tend to go back in time. So I went back another 100 years to try and figure out, is there another history of urban air which we don't know about? And my sense is that we do not quite know about it, for the simple reason that to the best of my knowledge, there is one essay on the history of urban air in India. published about 25 years back, and that's it. So what we have are very good works on the contemporary city, mostly around the politics of air. And there's some bit of anthropological work, but as far as history is concerned, we practically know nothing. And that's a pity, because one of the arguments that I'm going to propose to you is that there is something in that historical mode or in that historical experience which is worth thinking about, and there are things there which we need to discard, but we can only discard once we know what we're talking about. So that's basically where I'm coming from, is to look at a history of air that is not necessarily centered on land use planning. And that is what my new book is about, which is on Bombay and Calcutta, not on Delhi. Today is sadly an opportune moment to talk about waste and pollution. Nature reports that more than 3 million people die worldwide from air pollution, and if no action is taken, the number is likely to double by 2050. Of these, nearly 650,000 persons die in India alone, and another 1.4 million in China. WHO figures suggest 4.3 million premature deaths on account of indoor air pollution, with China and India once again losing the most number of people. Indeed, the unthinkable seems to have happened, and this is my core worry at the moment, where to breathe is to turn away from life. So all our lives we have lived that you go out and take in the fresh air, but now you are being advised, please do not step out early in the morning, especially if you're past 60 or 70. So to breathe is actually to die. And how does one think about something like that? So as I said, as we struggle to think about this, there's very little that we have on India. And in what follows, therefore, what I'll be doing is speaking about two different histories. The first, which is largely a history of the colonial period, in which questions of productive efficiency, and I'll come to this, what I mean by this, were more pronounced than spatial location. And a second, a period of roughly half a century from the 1960s, when strategies of spatial location gained prominence as a way of managing, among other things, the quality of our air. But before I do that, I have a slight different kind of argument to make, which is about the title of this paper, of the relationship between waste and pollution. There are, I suggest, important differences between waste as understood in the sanitary discourse as filth or garbage, and the miasma they produce, which is on the one side. This is what all the Swachh Bharat program is about, for instance. Okay? And waste, which is a product of using fuel in a way that does not do justice to its entire capacity. So that is also waste. Waste in the sanitary discourse, I just suggest, concerns its materiality, which needs to be disposed. By contrast, smoke as waste signifies the absence of efficiency, of the failure to consume fuel in a manner that could extract maximum energy and minimize emissions. Timothy Cooper thus makes an analytical distinction between filth and waste, the first being about abjection and the latter about the practices of realizing value. I prefer instead to treat this as the duality of waste, being both a material thing and a normative principle. So you waste something. You could waste time, for instance. In this case, we waste energy. Corruption of the air, which is a curious 19th century phrase, may thus be described through two distinct narratives. One, which I call sanitary, which is the more familiar one, about cleaning up the cities, and the other environmental. But this is environment with a difference, because there are no explicit environmental goals to be achieved. What you have is what the American historian Gorman calls a form of realizing efficiency which is about profits, not about environment. So the sanitary waste concerns the presence of rotten vegetation and miasma, while what I'm calling the environmental waste is about the concentration and dispersal of unburned carbon. The first demands large public works, The solution to the latter is offered in individualized use of relevant technology, each firm at a time. And in between the two is the issue of location. So what I'm arguing is that there are two different ways through which we have thought about air, whether it's the smell, whether it's the kind of contamination that is there. One which is a product of what we call organic waste, municipal waste, those kind of things, and the other which is a product of how we produce things. And in between those two will be something called location, which is about where do you locate the industry. So let me begin with the first, the colonial period. Modern sanitary science, born in mid-19th century England to deal with the adverse outcomes of urban and industrial revolution, quite expectedly traveled to the colony too. And as with much else related to water and waste, filth and miasma, the difference between spaces of good air and those with what was called vitiated air was articulated with regard to cesspools, dunghills, burial grounds, slaughterhouses, etc., the usual sites for the production of gases and vapors. Filth and waste were markers of disease, which traveled easily from native habitats to cantonments, and not surprisingly, sanitation was an important axis of imperial governance. Within this story of sanitation, I suggest clean water took primacy, with purity of air being something of a secondary concern, acquiring significance from sometime around the 1880s. Air and its improvement, analogous to water and waste, were thus used to mark out the colony as an inferior other. Street widening, building regulations, etc. were the usual sanitary responses, though for the most part the funds allocated for the same were far less than needed. The relative prioritization of wide streets over slum improvement, by which one meant air, sunlight, and open space for the poorer people, was also a matter of racial politics, and residents of the city were not hesitant to take exception to this either. Officials in turn shifted the blame onto the cultural habit of natives, the tradition of parda, which confined women to dark and ill-ventilated rooms, and the habits of the laboring poor, who privileged economic savings over sanitary dwellings. All this is to build up a case for a very simple thesis, which is, by and large, talks about air pollution are highly technical. But what I want to suggest to you is that there are deep cultural practices that go into thinking about air, most recently, as you can see, around the bursting of crackers at Diwali, which some have argued, does it interfere with freedom of religion, for instance? So there are other kinds of questions that need to be asked, which in the technical paper does not quite get addressed. So streets and homes apart, the question of vitiated air, I suggest, more specifically smoke, was also addressed in relation to everyday practices of burning the dead and incineration of waste. Though sanctioned by long custom and possibly by religious sentiment, the burning of dead in open air, both in itself and even more in its consequences, colonial officials argued, was inconsistent with public decency and detrimental to public health. Though there remains some uncertainty about the ways to understand this. Was smoke merely a nuisance, or was it also dangerous to health? Did the fumes necessarily give rise to diseases? Were these poisonous in and of themselves, or did the extent of harm depend on other factors ranging from the nature of a neighborhood to the direction of wind? And for these reasons, should burning ghats be compulsorily shifted out of cities or merely redesigned? And of course, there's a huge debate around this whole question. Eventually, they do not quite shift it out of the cities, but redesign it. So if you go to the Ningambod Ghat today, which I hope you don't have to, but you'll see that over this burning log, there's a structure, and above that structure, there's a chimney. And the idea is that this smoke then gets dispersed, which chimney is a product of the late 19th century. Closely aligned to the question of cremation was the issue of disposal of rubbish by incineration, again an issue that began to be debated with some seriousness around the turn of the century. By the turn of the century, 883 tons of rubbish was being handled in Bombay daily, the corresponding figure for Calcutta being 1,000 to 1,500 tons, a task beyond the capacity of traditional means of handling waste through their consignment in water bodies or in landfill sites. One approach was to make the disposal system more efficient. The alternative was to burn the waste. though the question remained whether one form of pollution was being exchanged for another. It will be no gain to the health of the town, the statesman opined, to poison people living within a certain radius of each incinerator by means of smoke from incinerator chimneys. And those of you who follow this whole debate around clean energy, waste energy plants that we are building all around Delhi now, the most controversial being in Okhla. And again, it's the same principle that you take the waste, you burn it because you don't want to put it in landfill sites, and you're going to somehow produce a cleaner city, except that the residents are protesting there, saying the dioxins are being produced and we are the ones who are suffering. So this is again an old debate in many parts of the world, including in India, where what do you do with the waste, and if you burn it, what happens? And there are protests about this both in Calcutta and in Bombay. And one of the reasons why the waste is such a problem in India is because the quality of waste is very different from that abroad. By abroad, I mean the West. And this is a waste which has far more moisture content, and therefore you need far more energy to dry the waste before you can burn it. And for that reason, it was never quite successful. But in any case, these are these ordinary, everyday practices of burning which have always been matters of concern. And this is what would be typical municipal concern, continues to be a concern till date, when you can have any number of things about don't burn your rubbish, don't burn the leaves, etc., till this date. But this is where things become different, and this is my core argument. But perhaps most importantly, air pollution in colonial cities was addressed most in relation to fuel use and modern industrial production. Dung, wood and biomass had been popular fuels for use in native households across India right through the 19th and 20th centuries. In Delhi, as in other cities, licenses had to be obtained for depots of hay, straw, thatching grass, wood, all considered dangerously inflammable materials. In time, with the growth of modern industrial enterprises, another fuel, namely coal, came to be increasingly used, and with coal came smoke, especially dense black smoke. This transition towards coal use was to be across many sectors, including the domestic and the commercial, traditional and modern, and the smoke produced equally in government mints and waterworks as in private factories. The consequences, however, were much the same. Air that had become polluted, and many did not like it. So there's a famous quote from Viceroy Curzon, which, and I'm just going to quote him, but there's one superficial feature of Calcutta that has greatly distressed me. This is Curzon writing. I allude to the Calcutta smoke, which sometimes makes one forget that this is an Asiatic capital, which besmirches the midday sky with its vulgar tar brush and turns our sunsets into a murky gloom. And so Curzon goes about doing a few things which I'll detail in a minute, but the important thing about this is that Curzon, when he returns to England, makes a speech in the British Parliament 10 years after what he has done in Calcutta, saying, look, we achieved such great things in Calcutta. Why can't we do it in England? And one of the things that he achieved was to get rid of the smoke, or so he thought. But this is an argument that he makes in the British Parliament in 1920s, yes. But before Curzon comes, something else had happened. Laws regarding smoke nuisance. Nuisance is a word that will come up a lot of times. Very quickly, there are two ways in which you can understand nuisance. One is, technically nuisance means that you do not undertake an activity that is likely to reduce the value of the property of your neighbor. Okay, it's a property discourse. Okay, and there's also an aesthetic side to it. So the Gertner book that you're talking about is mostly about nuisance as aesthetics. It is not about this loss of value, which is how nuisance law was practiced earlier. Laws regarding smoke nuisance had been first passed in 1862-63 in Bombay and Calcutta respectively, stating that furnaces in these cities should be so constructed as to consume or burn the smoke they produced, and this is the critical phrase, as far as possible. However, the municipal arrangement to ensure the same continued to be rather limited right through the 19th century, and as a consequence, observations for smoke remained rather uneven, and prosecutions were no more than occasional affairs. Owners and managers counterpoised the expertise of the engineers against the more rudimentary knowledge of the inspectors, and found it easy to convince magistrates that they had used the best possible available technology. And there's a lot of racial element that goes in here in terms of the expertise. Who is the greater expert? Local governments, it would seem, took this in their stride, not wishing to upset industry, but Government of India was increasingly convinced that the acts as they existed were antiquated and ineffectual. Fresh legislation was called for, and based on the advice of an English expert, smoke nuisance commissions were established in Calcutta and Bombay in 1905 and 1912 respectively. Remember, no city in the US or UK ever had a smoke nuisance commission. It was always a municipal affair with a smoke inspector. So what you get in India is a dedicated commission which is only going to manage smoke. Which commission then set time limits for emission of smoke and offered technological advice, leading Curzon to boast in the British Parliament, as I said, that much more had been achieved in Calcutta than was being done in London. Efficiency and... Yeah.
Was the production of smoke comparable in the West and in...
It was far more in the West?
At that time?
At that time. So,
Same time?
yeah. So when in Calcutta there was about 300 tons of coal being used, it was roughly about half of what was being used in Leeds, for instance. So industrial towns in UK were using far more, Sheffield, Leeds, etc. Not so much London. Therefore you find in that Curzon thing, this whole idea that doesn't feel like an Asiatic capital, you know, because it's okay to find smoke in Leeds and Sheffield, but what's smoke doing in Calcutta? This is supposed to be an Oriental place. Okay, so he was very...
It's also a celebrated quote by Engels, I think, where he talks about the smokestacks of Liverpool. Or
yeah, so it's okay if, you know, these are the industrial countries of the world. Oriental cities are not meant to be like that. And there's a lot of play around this idea of the Orient and what they're meant to be. You know, Orientals, one of the things that distinguishes Oriental cities from cities of the West is dust. Okay? Dust, quote unquote, is natural to the Orient. But smoke is not. So you'll find any number of descriptions about cities in our part of the world which emphasize this thing called dust. And so, for instance, in Athens, when water first came, and because this had been part of the Ottoman Empire, one of the ways they wanted to distinguish themselves from the Ottomans was by saying that we do not have dust. And therefore, when water first came, they took it for sprinkling it on the streets rather than giving it for drinking, because by that they reduced the dust. So that's the way they could claim that they were not part of the Ottomans anymore, but if you're part of the East, dust is our natural burden, as it continues till date, I guess. Again, I mean, what I'm trying to do is, you know, we have had a number of historical accounts that look at how difference has been produced between the West and the non-West, focused on issues of culture. So if you look at all the talk about alternative modernity, it is done through the cultural frame. What I'm trying to do in this work and many other works is how things like rivers, air, these get marked out as different. And not only as different, but also they set up this part of the world as inferior because of the quality of its air and water, etc. And so I'm looking at this whole play of difference that goes on in the book that I'm doing. And in this whole exercise, after they've set up the commission, there are two different phases, which seem to be common all across the world. Till about World War I, the emphasis is on prosecution and some bit of learning. Post-World War I, all over the world, there's this idea that if you want to eliminate smoke, you cannot do so by law. You have to work together with industry and create the right kind of knowledge among managers and owners so that they conduct their production in a manner that does not produce smoke. Okay? So the whole emphasis shifts to being partners. And this is a legacy that the first generation of historians attacked left, right, and center, saying that, look at this, basically government sold out industry. That was the argument. However, more recent work suggests that there's a more complex relationship that industry has to these issues for two reasons. One is that those who are producing things are placed very differently from those whose incomes come from the value of the land. So if you are running a tourist industry, for example, tourism, then that's going to harm you. So there are fractions within this whole business community, not all of whom think of smoke as progress or industry as progress. For some of them, it's a harm. So that's one reason why they do it. Second is industry does seem to have some stake in reducing costs. And sometimes it is prompted by that feeling that maybe this is the way in which we can both reduce our own costs and be good citizens. In the Indian story, the Tatas seem to have done that the most. They're always talking about how much they have contributed to beautifying Bombay by making the Bombay air clean. Okay? And if you look at the first Tata hydroelectric project, which is at Lonavala, the argument was that this hydroelectric energy will take away coal from Bombay and Bombay will become a very clean city. Except that there are protests elsewhere from the people whose lands were getting drowned because of this hydroelectric project, which is the first anti-dam protest in India that happened. Anyway, crucial though to bear in mind is that this was not quite an environmental discourse. There were no set environmental standards towards which one was to progress. Rather, the sole effort was aimed at reducing smoke through better design of furnace and chimneys so as to consume less coal while generating more power, what some historians have referred to as utilitarian conservation. And all this was to be done in close cooperation with industry. So this is the English expert who comes out to India. This is what he says. A wise legislation should not go so far as to hamper the industries of the country by prohibiting the use of its local resources. At the same time, the public have a just claim to such protective measures as can secure improved conditions of life without undue interference with commercial prosperity. In advising remedial measures, I feel deeply conscious of these issues and I'm anxious that a judicious compromise may be arrived at. And if you see, this is what we struggle with even today. So when our prime ministers or our leaders go to many forums across the world and say, we have to tackle poverty. If that means there's going to be some amount of production that is not clean, then so be it. There has to be a balance between these things. And this whole idea of where the right balance is, continues to be a matter of politics. So in the colonial period, the success was declared immediately, though a bit prematurely, with the commissions having to resort to increased prosecution in the 1930s after 2 decades of advice and improvement. They also had to worry about indoor pollution, about which there were no laws. This distinction between indoor and outdoor, again, is something that we live with today. So when you hear talks about pollution and air pollution, typically these are not about indoor air pollution. We're talking about outdoor air pollution. And this divide between the two emerges in the 1920s and 30s because both in England and in India, the perception is industrial smoke can be tackled, indoor smoke is far more difficult to tackle. Now to come to land use. So during this same period, in the colonial period also, there had also been the possibility of relocation. A policy briefly considered but not quite implemented till well into the 1930s. In Calcutta, it was believed that this was hardly a help as workers who continued to work in the industries that may be relocated would still have to face pollution. Not to mention the fact that the city suffered not from what was produced within its own limits, but also that which blew in from Howrah and other places. So how far are you going to go? In Bombay, it was only in 1914 when a new city development plan was proposed that the idea was mooted to relocate all industries to the northeastern part of the city following development of new railway lines. In Delhi, this was to happen even later, in the 1930s, when a new industrial area was proposed in the southwest of the city, the exact location again being determined by the direction of the wind and the possible adverse impacts of air pollution on nearby residential areas. But here too it is important to bear in mind that such relocation was perhaps as much about decongestion, moving labor out from the city center, as it was about prevention of pollution. And this is the labor and pollution story that doesn't get told as much. That as you throw out polluting work, you also throw out labor that is engaged with that work. And what happens to that labor then should be a matter of some concern. So briefly what I'm saying is that there are 3 or 4 different things that went in the colonial thing. First, it starts an aesthetic concern. People like Curzon don't like it. Not because they have any harm that they can prove. Okay, they simply don't like it. Then it becomes a matter of public health. Does it actually cause disease? Argument is yes, it does, maybe it doesn't. We don't quite know. At some point they say yes, TB is caused because of air pollution, then they say no, TB is not caused because of air pollution. But certain other diseases like pneumonia, etc., can be attributed to air pollution. The most important thing is a perception that the only way that you can get industry to cooperate is by telling them that using coal efficiently will reduce costs for you. So the entire thing is to persuade industry that getting rid of smoke is in their economic interest. Because if it's not in their economic interest, this will never happen. So in some ways, it remains for industry to decide whether it is in their economic interest or not. This then is the historical legacy. The question of smoke in ordinary domestic and public settings, and as regards industrial production, to be dealt with largely through fuel substitution and efficient production. Much was to change in this regard in the 1950s and 60s, bringing what had been a marginal feature, namely spatial relocation, to the forefront of urban improvement projects through planning and zoning. And this is the one that I've done in this book at length. I'm very briefly going to, maybe in a page or two, just read out what I argue there. Plans, James Scott informs us, operate to minimize the friction of progress. And it's a very interesting phrase that he uses. Operates to minimize the friction of progress. And so it was expected to be in India too. 3 features of it were basically important. First was technology of social scientific survey. The second was the regional dimension. And the third was zoning, which came together with planning. Now zoning, as you know, if you're inclined to know that history, which I don't know if you're inclined to do so, but in the US Supreme Court, there's a huge argument whether zoning is legally valid or should be legally valid or not. And proponents argue that zoning basically helps you take care of things that have not yet happened. Because under existing laws, you can only act if something has happened. So if I've gone and burnt something, caused a harm, then somebody can go to the court and say, look, this guy has caused me a harm, please do something. And zoning was introduced with a view that this is too late. You have to prevent things from happening. And basically what was being said was that if you locate things appropriately, then you will prevent many harms from happening. On the other hand, there were people who were arguing that who's going to make such decisions? These people who sit in municipal bodies know nothing. It is businessmen who know the cycles of business, and they are best placed to take such decisions. And zoning, therefore, should not be allowed. But in any case, the US Supreme Court rules that zoning will be allowed, and zoning and planning then becomes something of a fever. And especially in our parts of the world, where planning becomes this huge thing that must be done. So the plan was basically to allocate land for industry, commerce, living and playing, and other major types of urban land use in the most appropriate location for each, and interrelated to each other so as to produce orderliness and smooth functioning. So there's decency, there's order, there's functioning, there is efficiency, there is everything you can write into a plan. The Delhi Master Plan, if you read, is a wonderful document. Unlike most of the master plans, especially the first master plan, it's written very well, done by people who put in a lot of effort into it. It's another thing that it has issues that haven't quite worked out. But the main thing that I want to talk about the plan is what they had to say about industry. That's my concern, basically. So as far as the industry was concerned, a two-pronged strategy was needed. First, to attend to those industries that had large requirements of space and water, or created problems of waste and smoke. And secondly, to attend to the many widely dispersed industries that could be both of nuisance and non-nuisance types. Now, the big debate that happens is between what is hazardous and what is non-conforming. Basically, what the plan says, and this took me a while to figure out, not surprisingly, because the whole politics rests on this. The plan makes an argument that certain industries are hazardous, they must go out of the city. Whereas there are other industries that are located in the wrong place. They're not hazardous. Okay? So they must simply be relocated in places that are more appropriate for them. Now what happens is when this suggestion is made, and for about 20 years nothing quite happens, the city basically implodes, especially Delhi becomes too big, and the matter goes to the court, and I'll come to the court in a moment. But for about a decade or more, you don't quite know what is being talked about. So sometimes you feel as if people are talking that there should be no industry in Delhi. All industry must move out. Sometimes you get a sense that all industry that exists is illegal. But that's not quite the case. The plan does make provision for industry, except that it does not want it in the locations where they are. And this was the proposal that was made and that failed. Basically, there are a number of reasons why this failure happened, but the midterm review of the plan, which was done in the 1970s, said this is too Western. It doesn't suit our kind of economy, which is mixed use. This won't work in India, do something else. And a second master plan is then made for the city of Delhi, which plan also doesn't have much to recommend other than what had already been recommended, which is basically throw hazardous industries out and relocate those that are not quite in place. However, something else happens, which is that the Indian Supreme Court, for some reason, decides to make Delhi its urban lab. And I haven't quite figured out why this happens. There's only one hint of this that I've seen in a paper by Lavanya Rajamani, who's a legal scholar, saying that judges live in Delhi. And so they, but you don't quite know why are they so bothered only about Delhi? Why not about other cities in this country? So even if you look at the judgment that's passed yesterday or day before, which again talks about Rajasthan, Aravalli Hills. Yeah. But if you look at the justification is the people of Delhi are suffering. So Rajasthan government must give money to people of Delhi, because by getting rid of those hills is the people of Delhi who are suffering. But in any case, for some reason Delhi seems to be their favorite city, and they pass a lot of judgments about Delhi. In those judgments, there is a sense that Delhi was once a beautiful city, which it probably was, and has since there's been a fall. Now, how does one understand something like that? Historically, it is not quite the case that this has what has happened, that once beautiful city has been ruined. Okay, it's grown a lot. Certainly, it's grown much beyond what planners thought it would go. And one of the things that I've found useful to think with is a Brazilian scholar who suggests that this is not nostalgia for that which existed. This is simply nostalgia for that which has been denied in the present. Okay? So it's not necessary that something like this existed, but in order to make that argument, so there's a story about the city that has seen its fall. That's one part of it. The second part of it is, I don't know if you're familiar with Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which basically says we have a right to life. Right to life says that I cannot be deprived of my life except through due process of law. This is simple. Basically, it had to do with, can a policeman simply come and grab me and take me away, etc., as they're doing with the CBI chief these days. But we don't quite know. In the 1990s, what happens is that the Supreme Court of India, probably in the 1980s itself, begins to define what is life. So in this right to life, it is no longer concerned, or it is still concerned with the procedure of how you can be deprived of life, but it begins to define what is life. And one of the things it says is the right to a good environment is part of our right to life. Now, this is not quite written in the Constitution, but they interpret it in that manner. So, a lot of judgments that are passed regarding industry in Delhi or elsewhere is under this Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which is right to life. So, when this thing happens, basically they say take the industries out, relocate these other industries. Political parties are very upset because we don't quite know how many industries were there in the late 1990s. One estimate is about 96,000, another was 125,000. But across political parties, there's a very interesting play that happens. both the BJP and the Congress do not want to implement this. You see, because it means a lot of workers losing their livelihoods. It has huge political consequences. But the then Minister for Urban Development is absolutely clear that if you do not implement this, this is called for anarchy. And this is the rule of law that must be established. And therefore, he definitely does not believe that you can continue with what was programmed as in situ upgradation. That wherever there is more than 70% industry, you declare those areas to be industrial areas and live with it. So he obviously opposes. There's a huge politics that happens around this. And the question, as I said at the beginning, then remains that yes, if some industry did move out, something did happen, did it help us? And if it helped us, at whose cost? And my suggestion is probably at the cost of our neighbors in and outside Delhi, where a lot of this industry moved, the industry that moved. The role of the planning system focuses on whether the development itself is an acceptable use of land rather than the control of the processes or substances themselves. And that's where I think there's a need to marry these two histories. So one which is entirely about the process, very little about location, and the second which is almost entirely about location, very little about the process. Neither of them suffice. And so at this point, there's a reason why we have to think, how do you bring the two discourses together? It's not going to be easy because they have two very different routes, but there's a need to do that. That is on the location. There's something else which is about culture, which very briefly, I'm just going to take 5 minutes. Okay, so let me just read in the concluding section. The multiplicity of sources and sites of practices ranging from cooperation and efficiency to discipline and punishment, of aesthetic choices and health burdens, make evident that to think of air today as it was in the past necessitates the fusing together of diverse issues, from resource conservation to spatial relocation, and from conditions of work to democratic politics. Equally, it invites us to study air and its pollution in comparison between mills in the 19th and 20th centuries and between cities as they compete for national and global rankings today. Such intercity comparisons were not entirely missing in the past, with attention drawn to the similarities and differences not only between Calcutta and Bombay, but also between them and London and Chicago. However, it would be no exaggeration to suggest that today such comparisons have acquired an entirely new significance, defining more than other elements the attractiveness or otherwise of particular cities. Those of you who do any research in contemporary cities, I don't, so it's on my burden, but I would suggest to you that there's a new urban sensibility that's emerging, focused almost entirely on air. So if you open the Times of India, at least on 3 pages you'll find an air story, which is as many pages as are devoted to what is happening in CBI, for instance. Or if you look at apps that are being promoted of how you can measure own air, or if you go to any of the bigger markets and look at the sale of masks and air purifiers, basically what is happening is, I think if in the 19th century water was the main concern, by the 21st, water has almost completely gone out of our minds, because all of us have ROs. Okay, we can kind of do with water what we want, but air has become the new thing to think the city through. And it's not surprising, therefore, there's all this comparison between whose air is worse, Beijing or ours, or can you get the American system of measurement, or do we have our own systems of measurement? Or when a report comes out, the minister says, we don't believe this report, it's a Western study, we will do our own studies. You know, because you can see how air has become the thing to think about. And one of the things that we want to think about is this centrality of air. So as we acknowledge all this, we gain a measure of the legacy that remains with us and visions and strategies that must be shaped anew. There is most importantly, and in some sense the most difficult to dislodge, framing of the issue as clean air which does not compromise on jobs, or more broadly, the persistence of the binary of environment versus development. However, the history and offer also gives us the prospect of thinking otherwise, of recognizing that desirable environments are not something that are obtained after ensuring economic growth, but to recognize the thing called environment inheres in myriad practices for the manner in which commodities are produced to how they are consumed, from modes of travel to strategies of waste disposal. The emphasis on efficiency may have much to contribute still to how we reimagine production and consumption. Persuasion and publicity as key strategies in the making of cleaner cities may retain their purposes too. However, there is much about this legacy that needs to be jettisoned. Most importantly is technocratic and non-democratic character. The sources of air pollution as these have proliferated have brought in new actors, deliberating on air quality standards and climate change, even as we witness the ever-increasing personalization of airspace through masks and purifiers, while possibly continuing to ignore the fate of those who are subject to the greatest exposure, namely those who are workers and the homeless. It was believed then, and still in some quarters believed, that the way to deal with waste and pollution is to disperse it, to banish it from the immediate vicinity, to relocate industries or rearrange travel patterns. It did not quite work then. It will not work now, I suggest, save to create other communities of harm. Regional and national boundaries are no longer a barrier either, such that it would not suffice to engage with a city in isolation. Air moves, travels, and circulates inside spaces and outside in the city and the suburbs. An engagement with it requires thus an engagement that is simultaneously place-specific and fluid, attempting to reduce the extent of pollution at source, as also to manage it across larger geographies. It requires that folded inside spaces remain matters of concern, both the interiors of workspaces and homes, as also spaces which lie beyond administrative boundaries. To imagine otherwise, that is, to imagine an engagement with air that is confined only to the public arena of a bounded metropolitan space in a manner analogous to dealing with smoke in Bombay or Calcutta, or planning for industry in Delhi in the 20th century, would be to remain within the confines of what I call the colonial modernist imaginary. So there's a particular way of dealing with smoke, which is the legacy of this colonial and modernist imaginary, which we haven't quite jettisoned, despite 7 decades of formal colonial rule having ended. It would serve to do no more than create enclaves of relative cleanliness, passing on the economic and health burdens of contaminated air elsewhere and to other people, to those with the greatest potential of exposure to harmful air. This becomes even more critical as we recognize that it is not only the presence of contaminated air beyond a certain threshold, and this is a technical point about whether there is a threshold. And some people now argue there is no such thing as a threshold, and any exposure can do you harm. And therefore, to imagine air talk today as largely a dialogue of experts, of difference in strategy to be resolved through a rough consensus between the same experts, is to also miss entirely the social nature of air, the manner in which issues of class, gender, and spatial location are imbricated in the imaginations of clean and healthy cities. Swachh Bharat, I suggest, can certainly do better by making the dialogue on a desirable city with clean air and pure water a dialogue in democratic practice rather than in technocratic management, refusing the binary of jobs versus health, of residents versus workers, and if economic growth versus clean cities. A clean city, in my view, demands an environmental ethics which combines efficiency of production with sensitivity to environmental standards, to be arrived at through democratic negotiations. It demands a close attention to social and cultural framings as it does to scientific advice. What constitutes clean matter and what is dirty, and I'm happy to debate this, I'm suggesting what constitutes clean matter and what is dirty does not inhere in a thing alone, nor is it simply a matter of fact deduced in some laboratory setting, but is instead a joint product of research, interpretation, meaning-making, articulation of interests, and public actions as undertaken by diverse actors. So there are people who would suggest that the quality of something is objective and given. We can differ about how to manage it. I'm suggesting something else. The qualities that we attribute to something does not inhere in that thing alone. It is how we place that thing in a larger schema of things that the quality becomes clear. But so one could cite even more on the issue, but the limited point that I wish to make is that environmental issues, especially when these are intertwined with everyday practices of cooking, eating, celebrating festivals, marriages, birth, and death, often tend to have a cultural dimension that is articulated alongside the technical scientific literature. The world of scholarship, especially that engaged with policy making or resource use dynamics or urban transformation, I suggest, stands to benefit much by bringing this cultural dialogue up front, to provoke a different kind of dialogue about environmental and urban well-being than the more familiar one from scientific and planning studies. So let me end on that note, which is basically suggests that there is this whole other business of, is there a cultural discourse of the air? If it is there, where and how does it matter? Which certainly doesn't seem to matter in the policy literature. I haven't seen a single policy document that talks about the culture of air in a way that water is talked, or rivers are talked about, for instance, which is a deeply cultural thing. So let me end on that. I'll take questions.
The question is vis-a-vis your binary categorization, which is hazardous versus non-conforming, your original classification of miasmic versus efficient, smoke, dirt versus does that today also flow over at particular historical junctures? For example, when does something which is non-conforming become hazardous? Say in the 1890s when Bombay plague happened, then there's a whole rhetoric around miasma becoming overpowering, so to speak, and resulting in a lot of other sanitary. I don't know whether air has now reached a state from non-conforming to getting into slightly more. So the question is basically that, do these binary categorizations also change shape and contours? And are there particular historical moments that you found in your kind of colonial history where the binary doesn't hold, or one moves into another and then comes back into its own, etc. I have other questions, but I will come later.
Okay, let me just take it in the sequence that the questions are posed. On smoke and what is different now, well, the most obvious difference is that smoke only concerned what is visible. So dark, black, dense, and only concerned particulate matter. Okay, it's considered soot. What has happened now is that we are far more concerned with things that are invisible. And the gases that escape, and it is not as if then it was not known, but this is far more something that we attend to now. And in fact, if you look at smoke, it's hardly an issue in the major cities. It's these other things which have become issues. Whereas in smaller towns, still it's a smoke that continues to be a problem. So there is that big difference between what is it about the air that is being addressed today, and how is that different from what was being addressed in the 19th and 20th century. That's one big difference. The other big difference, of course, has happened is that the relationship with industry is far more conflictual. So there's an assumption through much of the early 20th century across the world till about the 1970s that this is a partnership between governments and industry. That once an environmental movement comes up across the world from the late 60s, 70s, it begins to question this easy, glove and coming together of industry and governments, saying this is a problem. It's not going to be solved by you guys just being chumps with each other. Okay, so that has changed in a big way, and obviously there is, in the context of rural environments, there's a Ram Guha thesis about, two different moments. One is an authoritarian moment of monocultural practices, and the other is a more democratic moment. And something of the kind you can see here also, that there is a far more democratic engagement with air than was the case earlier. Are there connected histories of rivers and air? I don't know. There are certainly parallel histories, and the irony is as follows. No law about river pollution was passed in the colonial period. Okay? But there's far more debate about what to do with river pollution. Whereas with air pollution, we actually had a law, but a law that was rather ineffective. And so right through the 100, 120 years or 150 years that these laws operated, nothing much happened. So there's a big difference between how rivers were tackled and how air was tackled. Why that happened, I don't know. Why we failed to pass, or why the then state failed to pass a law about river pollution, I don't quite know. But this is as far as I know. On malaria and bad air, yeah, I'll just come to the category. Malaria and bad air is interesting to think through, because as you said, it's a product of miasma and all that. I can suggest to you a book by Linda Nash, where her argument is an interesting one, that while miasma is bad in theory, it was good for the environment. Because if you felt that the gases and the fumes that were produced by rotten vegetable or rotten organic waste actually harmed you, you took care of it. So that which was bad in science was actually good in practice. Whereas once you get the germ theory, then you have no necessary reason to take care of your immediate environment. Because the whole thesis about how disease happens changes. So it's a fantastic book on the US. It's called Inescapable Ecologies, which looks at this whole miasma business that happens. On the categories flipping from one to the other, yes, they happen all the time. As I said, the most difficult political question was that while in law it seemed that the categories of hazard and non-conforming were very clear, or in the plan, in actual practice, it was very difficult to come up with which is the hazardous one, which is the non-conforming one, which produces nuisance, which does not produce nuisance, etc. So except for the very large hazardous ones, which are easy to identify, on everyday level, if you have a factory somewhere in this neighborhood, which we don't, who's going to test for it? What is it doing? And so therefore you see in actual practice, even in the court's orders, quite often there is a confusion about what we are dealing with. Are we dealing only with hazardous? Are we dealing with non-conforming? Is it not desirable because it is in the wrong place, or it because it does you some harm? And that is the question that has driven this whole thing about what to relocate, where to relocate, and what to welcome. What began to bother me, at some point I was bothered about this confusion, but far more I began to get bothered when you saw advertisements, say from the government of Rajasthan, saying industries that are being driven out of Delhi, you're most welcome to come here. And you're wondering, what the hell is happening in this country? So we are throwing out industries from this city because they're not good for our air, and there's another government in a neighboring state putting out an ad. Please come here. We will offer you X, Y, Z. So there's something clearly very limited about this policy of relocation. It can do so much and no more. And basically what it does is what in the US they've called the Nimby Phenomenon, which is not in my backyard. You just take it elsewhere. And you can go and see this all around in Ghaziabad, elsewhere, where all this industry has gone.
When you're talking about air, you're still talking largely about topical pollution. So within the city, toxicity that then affects the residents of that city. Now that we're talking about global warming, right, that is a slightly different phenomenon, because even though it is topically produced, the results are not specific to the immediate residents of the city. How does that play out in terms of cultural responses to thinking about the quality of air? Because now the discourse on air quality is also a discourse on carbon emissions. It's not just a discourse on particulate matter. And so is there a broader cultural response, maybe outside of the cities, or maybe not yet, that you've seen that has some interesting implications for what we might do?
Linked is my second question, is entering the debate. Is that CO2 is CO2 is CO2, and 2 degrees is 2 degrees, and 1.5 degrees is 1.5 degrees. So, is there something that inheres in 2 degrees and which is outside the cultural question, or are we just again doing the same old mistake of taking it out of history and saying?
I mean, this is a big and complex debate. I obviously cannot answer all parts of it. 2 degrees is of course 2 degrees and 1.5 is 1.5, but what it means and for whom changes a lot depending on where you are and what you're doing. My response to that is as follows. In one way of thinking about environment, there's a certain sequencing. So first you deal with matters of urban poverty, let's say bad drinking water. Then you deal with industrial pollution. Then you deal with what are called lifestyle issues, okay, and where climate change, etc. So there's certain sequencing. This is tied to your incomes. This is the familiar thesis. As your income levels grow, you begin to bother about different things, and at some point, environment becomes an amenity that you're willing to pay for. And therefore, you move from basic necessity to cleaner air and now to climate change. So my first proposition is that in India and countries like India, we will not have the luxury of this sequencing. So all of it has to be attended together, which is easier said than done. Because what happens is once you have money flowing into climate change, it's going to be very difficult to find money for other things. It's not as if people are waiting to say that yes, everything matters, let's evenly share it. There are certain things that will get priority. So that's one thing that will happen. In the specific case of air, we do know, for instance, that when the debate around replacing diesel by CNG was happening, this question of methane that was going to be emitted, this was posed as a local versus global issue. That what could be a local advantage could be globally disastrous, or not disastrous, but could be globally problematic. Same with this waste to energy plant, which is coming out of the Clean Development Mechanism money, but which for local residents has become an issue. So this is not going to be a game where there's going to be win-win. There are going to be trade-offs. Sometimes the local will be privileged, sometimes the global will be privileged, and a lot depends on who the stakeholders are. My own sense is that we do not, let's take the best from the climate change debate, which is to say that yes, we know our familiar differences, we know our familiar fault lines between left and right, but there's a way in which the human species has acted that has led us to the situation where the entire world could collapse. Okay? So let's take that warning seriously. Having taken that, I think it still remains important to ask who the losers and who the... Yes, it is true that at one level all of us are potentially at risk, but that does not mean that some are not at greater risk than others. It's a difficult question. Yes, there's talk about carbon emissions, there's talk about carbon capture, there's all that thing that's happening, which is very different from the kind of story that I was narrating.
I guess my question is, does this come into the political negotiation right now?
Oh yes, it does. I mean, you can see this around the waste to energy plant. So despite its failures, despite the fact that there's so much protest, if you look at the planning and how many more are going to be set up, you can see how much investment there is in that kind of thing. So yes, it comes up in the political map. There's also a cynical side to this, which is you can find any number of people who are in important positions, managing important things, who if you ask them, for instance, I will not name this person, but he was at one point the head of the Jal board in Delhi, and I interviewed him for what were they doing about climate change and the matter to them, etc. He said, "Kuch nahi, wahi kar rahe hain, naam badal diya hai." So there's also a cynical way in which people respond, that we will continue to do the usual, now we'll give it another label because that is what sells. Now that's not what I'm, that obviously happens on an everyday basis, but that can't be the response. That's as far too cynical.
So recently I had this very interesting incident wherein my flatmate had got into a fight with this person who comes to collect waste, And then I started getting into the roots of it, that what happens to the waste where it goes and all. And then I realized that the rest of it is sold to some companies that are working outside Delhi, and they process this waste and they make energy out of it. So do you happen to know more about this, that how efficient this system is and what it is doing? Because if it is efficient, then it's a pretty good thing that's happening.
I'm afraid I don't know too much about it. What I do know is people who work on these issues. So there's Chintan, there is Toxic Lane, there are any number of people in Delhi who work on this. What I also know is that there are new entrepreneurs who have come into this sector, typically based out of Noida, etc., who run these waste to plants. And the third thing that I know is there is also an organization of rag pickers which has been saying that in this name of efficiency, we are being kicked out of this whole thing. So there is this thing between labor, who's going to do the recycling, who's going to do the waste picking, because one thing is, efficiency is an interesting concept to think through because it typically doesn't like friction. So it designates any number of groups as unnecessary intermediaries. And it wants to go direct from here to the plant. And so there are livelihood issues, there are those kind of issues which are there. But I do know that this is one sector that is really growing because there's a lot of demand about how to deal with waste because municipalities are not being able to deal with it.
I've been living in India about 2 years. And I talk to a lot of my foreign friends and a lot of my Indian friends, and I find such a difference in the way they think about air pollution. It's an exaggeration. Almost all of the foreigners I talk to are appalled. And so many of the Indians take it for granted. This is the air I've always had, this is the air I grew up in. I think about the pictures that you see from Beijing, where ordinary citizens, not foreigners, but ordinary citizens walk around in masks. Because here you don't see anybody wearing masks except maybe some of the Westerners. So what is there about India that leads it to have, I think, the top 10 or 8 of the top 10 places worldwide in air pollution? What is there about the Indian culture? And I take your point about the hierarchy of economic needs, but there are lots of places poorer than India that don't have India's air pollution. What is there about India that leads people to be so blasé and accepting about the level of contamination? Do people understand, do you think, how bad it is, how hazardous it is, the figures you cited about fatalities? Are people closing their eyes, or are they just unaware?
Your guess is as good as mine. I really don't know. Two, three things I could suggest to you, and this is maybe not India specific. One is air pollution, or being bothered about air pollution, is seen as being too bourgeois. Only fashionable people bother about air. Ordinary people get on with their lives. And that remains. This was the case certainly 15 years back. There has been a recognition now that this is a public health hazard, but that recognition is extremely slow. And you can see that in the way our governments respond to critical reports that come out from abroad. Because the first reaction is, this is Western, this is against us, we are not going to buy this. So there's this sense that air is not quite as important. This is something that you'll also find many activists sharing, that any number of progressive activists will say water is far more important. This is what really affects the poor. Air is not something that, beyond a point. The second is, for the longest time, because air was seen as something which has a chronic impact, not an epidemic kind of thing. So historically, that's one of the reasons why air gets the second billing. So the cholera and the water and etc. get the first billing, and air gets the second billing. But that's been the historical case. I don't know why that should continue to be the case today. So, and the third is maybe we just, I don't know how to put it. On the one hand, there's so much air talk today. As I said, if you open the Times of India, I mean, it's on any number of pages, you'll find this whole air business being talked about.
Is it a culture of normalization?
Sorry? Culture of?
Normalization, like, you're getting used to it right now. Like, it's like, as he said, that, people, ordinary people in Beijing, they're wearing masks, and it's being very normalized there. And similarly, it's happening in cities like Delhi, or in cities in India, like in Raipur also, or in any other part of the city, Indian air polluted city, like the culture of normalization which is happening, people getting used to it, and slowly they're accepting, air purifiers now. The alternatives are, they've been given, buy more air masks, but no concrete steps. Like the recent step, which I remember, the Air Pollution Commission, which recently got set up in Delhi, but I don't know.
Well, Delhi has a graded response system, which kicks in depending on the air quality. But no, I would like to think about it, because there's obviously something about this thing not quite being a real thing has yet not happened. I mean, we still, despite all the air talk, you scratch the surface and you'll suddenly find that we're not as bothered about, what causes. Second is, it's only now that we are beginning to address the many sources through which this is happening. So construction dust, vehicular pollution, and these means that the middle classes have to make some tough choices, which I don't think they're in a mood to make. So if you just see what happened with our odd-even scheme, even the government proposed it only for 3 months. I mean, even for those 3 months we protested. So the first thing you want to know is, why the government so scared? If they think it's a good thing, why not try it out at least for a year, or at least for the same 3 months over 5 years? But quite clearly they think that the middle class will be too upset. So I think air will demand sacrifices, because it's going to concern production, transport, construction, all those things, which maybe we are not yet willing to make. We are too busy making money. I don't know.
Even now there's no talk of BRT corridor.
Huh?
BRT corridor.
BRT corridor, because the car guys protested. Look, BRT corridor, you think about it, look at the irony of this. The BRT corridor, car owners protested. There was then a Congress government in the city that did not side with the BRT corridor. Then comes an AAP government, which is a populist government. What do? They take hammers and break the damn BRT. Okay? Corridor. And they publicize it. So there's quite clearly something about middle class aspirations which should not be touched. That still remains.